My name is Daniela, and for 18 years, I lived with my parents, Nilda and Gasper, in a modest two-story house in Florence. Our home was never filled with warmth or carefree laughter like in the movies, but I had accepted that this was my life. My parents were practical, serious people, entirely focused on their work. My mother was an accountant who spent her evenings buried in calculations and numbers. My father was a salesman, always busy with phone negotiations and closing deals. They fulfilled their duty, they provided for me, helped with my homework when I asked, but there was always a distance between us. There were no spontaneous hugs, no warm words, none of those "I love you" I heard in other families. I told myself that this was just their nature, that not all families needed to be affectionate to be good. "We need to talk after dinner," my mother said that morning on my 18th birthday. Her tone was unusually serious, but I didn't give it much thought. Maybe they had planned something special. Though, up until now, none of my birthdays had ever been an event. I sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly picking at a slice of pizza I had chosen for dinner. My mother had barely touched her portion, and my father kept checking his phone, clearly preoccupied with something important. Finally, he set it down, looked at me, and spoke. "Daniela, your mother and I have been planning something for a while, and now that you've turned 18, it's time to tell you." I straightened in my chair, expecting news about college preparations or maybe even a surprise gift. What came next hit me like a bucket of ice water. "We're selling the house," my mother stated plainly. "Your father and I are moving to Europe to start a business there." I blinked, trying to process what I had just heard. "Oh, okay. When are we leaving? I need to sort out my college applications." "No," my mother interrupted. Her voice was sharp. "We are moving. You are not coming with us." A heavy weight dropped in my stomach. "What?" My voice came out too high-pitched, almost childish. "I don't understand." "You're 18, my father said calmly, as if discussing a business strategy. "You're an adult. It's time to start your own life." I stared at them, searching their faces for some sign that this was a joke, a mistake, anything that would make this sound less terrible than it did. "But, college? We talked about this. I'm supposed to start in a few months." "That's your responsibility now," my mother said evenly as she stood to clear the table. She didn't even look at me. "Honestly, Daniela," she continued, "you've been a burden all these years. We fed you, clothed you, supported you for 18 years. That's more than enough." I stared at her in horror. Those words struck harder than a slap. "A burden?" I whispered. My throat tightened, and tears burned behind my eyes. But my mother didn't acknowledge it. She calmly loaded the dishwasher, as if she wasn't shattering my world in that moment. "You can stay here until we sell the house," my father added, his voice carrying a tone of indulgent generosity, as if this was some great favor. "But the sooner you figure out your situation, the better for everyone." I sat frozen as my parents continued discussing the logistics of selling the house, real estate prices, paperwork, moving details. Their conversation drifted above me like the distant hum of a radio. 18 years of memories shifted, redefined in an instant. I replayed every lukewarm compliment instead of a hug, every quiet family dinner, every missed school play. They weren't just reserved. They weren't just emotionally distant. They had been counting down the days until they could finally be rid of me. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. My head pounded, my thoughts tangled, and a heavy numbness settled in my chest. Yesterday felt like a dream, a long, terrible nightmare, but the moment I opened my eyes and saw the familiar walls of my room, reality sank in. I had been erased from my parents' lives with cold precision, like an unwanted weight finally cast off. My hands trembled as I dialed my grandmother Gabriella's number. She picked up after the second ring, her voice warm and gentle, like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "Daniela, sweetheart, is everything okay? You never call this early." I opened my mouth, but only a sob escaped instead of words. As soon as I managed to gather my thoughts, I told her everything, about the birthday dinner, my parents' announcement, my mother calling me a burden. I could hear my grandmother's breathing grow heavier, more unsteady on the other end of the line. "Those absolute," she muttered under her breath. I had never heard her use that word before. Then her voice became firm, resolute. "Pack your things, Daniela. You're coming to live with me. Right now." She didn't have to say it twice. I jumped out of bed, grabbed the largest suitcase I could find in the attic, and started throwing in whatever I could: clothes, photos, my laptop, a few pieces of jewelry. My fingers were shaking so badly that I could barely zip the suitcase shut. Downstairs, my parents were still discussing real estate prices. They didn't even glance in my direction as I struggled to drag my heavy suitcase past them and out the door. No goodbyes. No questions about where I was going. No regret. They had gotten rid of me, and it seemed like they did it with relief. My grandmother was waiting for me on the porch when I arrived at her house. The moment I stepped out of the car, she walked toward me and, without saying a word, wrapped me in a hug, warm, strong, the kind I had always longed for from my mother. I buried my face in her shoulder, feeling safe for the first time in a long while. She led me inside, a cozy, welcoming home, filled with the scent of cinnamon and vanilla. This house had always been a refuge for me, but now it had become my salvation. "First things first," my grandmother declared, setting a mug of hot chocolate with marshmallows in front of me, just like she used to when I was a child. "You're going to college. I have savings, and they're going to be put to good use, sending my granddaughter to school." I shook my head, guilt washing over me. "Grandma, I can't take your money." "You're not taking it," she interrupted firmly. "I'm giving it to you." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "And one more thing," she added after a pause. "I'm changing my will." I lifted my head, not understanding what she meant. "This house, my savings, everything will go to you, Daniela. Not a single penny to your mother." I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Her face remained steady, but there was determination in her eyes. "This house isn't a mansion, but it's paid off," she continued. "The savings aren't millions, but they're enough. And all of it will be yours." Later that evening, as we sat in her small but cozy living room, my grandmother brought up another topic. "We need to agree on something, Daniela," she said cautiously. "I think it would be best if we didn't discuss what happened." I nodded. I didn't want to talk about it anyway. "Good girl," she said approvingly, patting my hand. "Let them think what they want. The important thing is that we know the truth." And so, my new life began. The rhythm of student life quickly became familiar. I woke up to the smell of my grandmother's coffee and her soft humming in the kitchen. We had breakfast together before I left for class, and in the evenings, I told her about my day while she worked on crossword puzzles. Sometimes, relatives stopped by to visit my grandmother. During one of these visits, my Aunt Sarah, chatting about nothing in particular, casually remarked, "Oh, you're here? Nilda and Gasper finally made it to Europe and started some kind of business there." "That's what I heard." I simply nodded and excused myself, saying I was tired. The hardest part was hearing the comments about my supposed independence. They came regularly, wrapped in admiration, and every time, I wanted to scream. "You're such a strong young woman," Uncle Bruno said during one visit. "Taking responsibility for your life, moving out on your own, at your age, that's impressive." "Yeah," my cousin Daphne chimed in. "Not every girl your age would choose independence over living with her parents." I forced a smile and changed the subject. "Those words, strong, independent, determined, felt like a cruel joke. Because the entire story my parents had told the family was a lie. It was easier for them to explain my departure with their fabricated tale of a driven daughter who was so eager to start her adult life that she moved out right after school. It was easier for me to let them believe it. The truth was too painful to tell. And then came the worst day of my life. My grandmother had been feeling exhausted for weeks, but we both brushed it off. We told ourselves it was just age, just fatigue, just the winter blues. We were wrong. By the time we realized it was something more, it was already too late. The doctors used terrifying words: aggressive, advanced stage. I couldn't understand them. I didn't want to understand. Everything happened too fast. It felt like I was watching someone else's life as I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her fragile hand in mine. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Daniela," she whispered one night. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were clear. I squeezed her fingers, trying to memorize every detail of her face, every wrinkle, every strand of her silvery curls. She passed away 3 months later. A year before I was supposed to graduate. The funeral was simple, yet many people came. Everyone, except my parents. They were informed, Aunt Sarah said dryly. But they can't come back from Europe on such short notice. I wasn't surprised. I graduated with honors, holding my diploma tightly, fighting back tears. Because the one person I wanted to see that day could no longer be there. But my grandmother had prepared me for everything, even for her absence. Thanks to her generosity, I had opportunities. I used part of my inheritance to buy a cozy apartment closer to the city center, where I got a job at the investment firm Preston and Associates. I decided to keep her house and rent it out. I couldn't sell it, but living there without her was unbearable. Life has a strange way of throwing surprises at you when you least expect them. That's how I met David. He walked into the wrong room. He had been looking for a conference hall for a client meeting, but the location had been changed. Instead, he found me, buried in scattered papers and empty coffee cups, preparing for an important presentation. "Either this isn't the board-owned meeting, or they've radically changed their marketing strategy," he joked, taking in the chaos around me. I couldn't help but laugh. "Next door," I said, nodding toward the correct room. "But at least you found someone who appreciates good coffee." One coffee date led to another. Before I even realized it, we were spending every free moment together. David was different. Unlike anyone I had ever met. Warm, sincere, patient. When I finally told him about my parents, he simply held me in his arms. He listened. No attempts to fix anything. No empty reassurances. "You didn't deserve any of that," he whispered, wiping away my tears. A year and a half later, after that fateful wrong turn into my conference room, David took me to dinner. At the very same restaurant where we had our first date. He seemed unusually tense all evening. Fidgeting with his napkin, checking his pocket every few minutes. When dessert arrived, I saw the ring, resting beside the chocolate soufflé, its diamond catching the candlelight and scattering it in dazzling reflections across our table. I held my breath. "I want to build a family with you," David said, his voice slightly unsteady, but filled with sincerity, and with all the love I had always deserved. I looked into his eyes, feeling happiness swell inside me, filling every empty space. "Yes," I whispered through tears, light, warm tears, nothing like the ones I had shed before. For the first time in years, I felt truly whole. The next day, I posted a picture on social media, my hand adorned with the ring, David holding me from behind. The caption read, "Yes. Forever. With my best friend." My heart was so full of joy it felt like it might burst. 2 days later, a message appeared in my inbox. The moment I saw the sender's name, my stomach clenched. Mom. I froze, then finally opened it. Dear Daniela, your father and I just saw your wonderful news. We are so incredibly happy for you. We know we have no right to ask this, but we have spent years regretting how we treated you. Not a day goes by that we don't think about our terrible mistakes. We would love to come to your engagement party, to try and make amends. We'll understand if you say no, but we miss you so much. With love. Mom and Dad. I stared at the words until they blurred before my eyes. When David came home, I showed him the message. My hands were shaking. What do you think? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. David read the letter twice, then wrapped an arm around my shoulders. It's your choice, he said. But if they really have changed, if they regret it, maybe they deserve a chance to prove it. I thought about my grandmother. About what she would have said. She would probably have warned me to be careful, but at the same time, she would have told me to follow my heart. I sighed. One chance, I whispered, more to myself than to David. I typed a short reply. The party is next Saturday at 7 p.m. You can come at 6 p.m. to talk first. My hands wouldn't stop shaking as I got ready that Saturday evening. David gently squeezed my shoulder, pressing a kiss to my cheek. I'll go pick up the catering, he said. Will you be okay? I nodded. At exactly 6 p.m., the doorbell rang. I took a deep breath and opened it. My parents stood on the doorstep. My mother, in an expensive, elegant dress. My father, in a sharp suit. They looked exactly as they had the last time I saw them, yet now, they felt like strangers. Daniela, sweetheart, my mother stepped forward, her arms reaching for an awkward embrace. I stood still, letting her hug me, but not returning it. You look wonderful, she said. And what a lovely apartment. We moved into the living room. They sat on the edge of the couch, as if unsure whether they were welcome to make themselves comfortable. My father made a comment about the decor. My mother asked about work. They acted as if we were distant acquaintances at a cocktail party, not family. Then my father cleared his throat. His pleasant expression slipped, like a mask sliding out of place. Daniela, let's get to the point. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. The point of what? We know about your situation. My situation? My mother leaned forward, her eyes sharp, cold. We know about grandmother's inheritance. The house. The savings. All of it. I froze. We did our research. I let out a cold laugh. What research? The house is worth at least $300,000 in today's market, my mother stated in the same tone she might use during a business presentation. And knowing grandmother, she must have had significant savings. Plus, you're doing quite well, nice apartment, wealthy fiancé. Get to the point, I said, my voice trembling. My father leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. We want $70,000. I went pale. What? It's less than we're actually entitled to, he added. But we're being reasonable. I stared at them, speechless. Calmly, my mother pulled a small leather notebook from her purse, flipped through a few pages, and stopped when she found the right spot. I've done the calculations. Her voice was cold, businesslike, as if I were not her daughter but someone she was negotiating with. As her daughter, I have inheritance rights. If you refuse to give us the money, we will take you to court and claim half of everything, the house, the accounts, the assets. My heart clenched. You can't be serious. I whispered. Oh, we are. My father's voice sharpened, taking on an unmistakable edge of fret. If you don't cooperate. He let the words hang, giving them weight, then leaned forward and spoke slowly, deliberately. I will make sure everyone knows how you manipulated your grandmother. How you turned her against us, convinced her to cut her own daughter out of her will. I shook my head, unable to believe what I was hearing. You don't know what really happened. It doesn't matter what really happened, my mother said coolly, making another note in her little book. What matters is what people will believe. She lifted her gaze to mine, studying me. Do you want your relatives to hear how you schemed to get your grandmother's money? Do you want David's family to think you're a heartless, greedy woman? A lump formed in my throat, suffocating. At that moment, the doorbell rang, guests arriving early. I stood up on unsteady legs, desperate for time to think. Think fast, my father said, adjusting his tie. We want an answer. They walked out just as David's parents entered the apartment, smiling, congratulating me. I forced a fake smile, but the entire evening, I felt like I was watching everything from underwater. The next morning, after the party, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. David had left for work, but not before wrapping his arms around me and whispering, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." I looked at the screen for a long time. Then, without hesitation, I dialed their number. My mother answered on the first ring. Have you made your decision? No greeting. No pleasantries. Yes, I said, taking a deep breath. I'm not giving you any money. Grandma made her choice, and I respect it. There was a sharp, angry breath on the other end. You'll regret this, my mother hissed before hanging up. They didn't waste time. That evening, my phone started vibrating non-stop with notifications. They had made a post. Long, theatrically emotional, filled with sad emojis and carefully filtered photos of them looking weary and broken. Our hearts are shattered. After losing everything in Europe, our home, our business, our savings, we turned to our only daughter for help. But Daniela, living in luxury with her wealthy fiancé, refused. Now we are homeless. Moving from place to place, unsure of where we'll sleep tomorrow. How did we raise such a heartless child? The post spread instantly. My phone exploded. Daniela, how could you? Your parents raised you for 18 years. You have plenty of money now. Why can't you help? Ed and Martha called me in tears. They need a place to stay. Your grandmother's house is just sitting there. Why can't your parents live in it? Message after message flooded in. I couldn't breathe. But the worst message came from my uncle. Your grandmother would be ashamed of you. Your parents sacrificed everything for you. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell the whole truth. But every time I tried to type a response, a lump formed in my throat. And then the cancellations began. Daniela, I'm sorry, but I just can't celebrate while your parents are suffering. My cousin Daphne left a cutting comment, another nail in the coffin of my patience. Then came a relative with a rebuke, and another, each new accusation adding weight to the pain already tearing me apart. But the final, most devastating blow was a message from Uncle Bruno. The man who had always been kind to me at family gatherings, who used to toss me into the air as a child and catch me, settling me onto his lap to tell me stories. The man who once called me smart and told me I would go far. His letter was short, precise, like a legal document. He informed me that he would be representing my parents in their lawsuit against me. He explained that the will could be contested and that the law was on their side. At the end, he advised me to reconsider my stance before things got truly ugly. I sat in my dark apartment, rereading those lines over and over until the cold realization settled deep inside me. My entire family now saw me as the monster my parents had always believed me to be. Only for entirely the wrong reasons. When David came home, he found me sitting in the dark, still staring at the screen filled with accusations, disappointment, contempt. He didn't ask anything. He just pulled me into his arms. His embrace was warm, steady. But even he couldn't silence the hollow roar inside me. I sat down at my computer. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. A deep breath, then I started typing. For 8 years, I had stayed silent about what had happened between me and my parents. I had let everyone believe their version of events because the truth was too painful to tell. But now, I had no choice. I wrote about the night of my 18th birthday, how my parents sat me down at the table and announced they were selling the house and moving to Europe. They didn't offer to take me with them. They simply stated that they had supported me for 18 years, and that was more than enough. They refused to help with college. Refused to support me in any way. Allowed me to stay in the house only until it was sold. I didn't choose independence, as they had told everyone. I was abandoned. I wrote about how that same night, my grandmother Gabriella took me in, gave me a home, paid for my education, showed me what unconditional love truly was. And now, my parents had returned, demanding $70,000, threatening to sue me if I didn't comply. They had threatened to ruin my reputation. But my grandmother, wise as she was, had seen this coming. My hands trembled as I uploaded a video beneath my post. My grandmother's face filled the screen. She looked tired but resolute, sitting in her hospital bed. In the background, the silhouette of her lawyer, Mr. Bordone, was visible. She spoke with certainty, with the quiet strength that had always lived within her. She called my mother by name, explaining that she was recording this video in full control of her mind and memory. She knew my mother would try to contest the will. And so, she wanted to make it clear exactly why she had left everything to me. She remembered how, 8 years ago, my parents had thrown me out of their lives. How they had refused to support me. How they had left me alone. She remembered how my mother had called me a burden. And she didn't want them to have the chance to use me again after she was gone. I hit post. The video ended, and for a brief moment, the screen went dark. But the silence didn't last long. Within minutes, responses started pouring in. First, comments, short, stunned, as if people couldn't find the words. Then, private messages. The first call came from Uncle Bruno. He usually spoke with confidence, as a lawyer should. But now, there was something broken in his voice. He kept saying he had no idea what my parents had done to me. That he was ashamed of his words. He was dropping the case. Immediately. Then, Aunt Sarah called. Her voice trembled with tears. She remembered that night, my 18th birthday, when she had come by with a gift, only for my parents to tell her I had moved out. She had believed them then, because they sounded so proud when they spoke about how I was eager to start my adult life. Now, she asked how they could do this to their own daughter. The family group chat exploded. Message after message, shock, apologies, support. My cousin Daphne, who had canceled her invitation to my wedding just days ago, wrote me a long letter. She apologized for judging me without knowing the truth. For believing my parents' words. She begged me to let her come to the wedding, so she could stand by my side and support me. One by one, the people who had turned their backs on me days ago were now reaching out, saying they were sorry. Cancelled invitations were reinstated. And the relatives who had once looked at me with condemnation now wanted to be part of my day. Even distant relatives I barely knew were sending messages of sympathy and support. I replied to each one, saying I held no resentment. Through whispers and rumors, I heard that my parents had moved in with old college acquaintances. Their life in Europe had been far from their dreams. They had lost their business, their savings, and were now scraping by with odd jobs. My mother had found work as an accountant at a small firm, while my father took whatever sales-related work he could find. Their grand plans had collapsed. People expected me to feel guilty. Guilty for telling the truth. Guilty for exposing them in front of the whole family. But as I sat in my apartment the night before my wedding, staring at my grandmother's photograph on the mantel, all I felt was peace. You were right, Grandma. The truth really did set me free. David found me there, wrapping his arms around me from behind, resting his cheek against my shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. I thought of that frightened 18-year-old girl, packing her suitcase, not knowing what lay ahead. Of my grandmother, who had saved me with her love and foresight. Of the woman I was becoming, strong, wise, no longer carrying the weight of someone else's lies. "Nothing," I said. And I meant it. Tomorrow, I would walk down the aisle, surrounded by people who knew the real me. Who understood the pain I had endured and the strength it had given me. Somewhere in the room, there would be empty seats meant for my parents. But they wouldn't matter. I had everything I needed. Love. Truth. And finally, the peace I had longed for and deserved. Some might say I was heartless for not helping my parents in their time of need. But now I know. Family isn't about blood. It isn't about obligation or duty forced upon you since childhood. Family is love. Support. Honesty. And sometimes, the best thing you can do is let go. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on this story, and don't forget to like and subscribe. See you soon.